You know it today as Harper Boulevard. It is one of our city's major thoroughfares. This 6-lane modern roadway was the first street constructed in what we today call Costa Mesa. But do you know what it was called way back then? Well, the answer is going to surprise you.
It also ended right about here. So why then were thousands of people coming to where the road ended? Well, we're going to tell you about that later. But here's a clue. They came to see their own Field of Dreams.
Come on, wait,
Will you be paying by cash or check, man?
Okay, class, if you're aware of the
Wait, can you Costa Mesa business big this afternoon?
Big round of applause for this year's winner, Judge Dodge from Costa Mesa. Costa Mesa.
Hey, there are a lot of interesting stories about Costa Mesa that many of us may not know. Stories about the people, the places, and events that have definitely had a very big impact on our lives today. That's why history is so important, because most of the time it gives us an insight into why things are the way they are today. Check this out.
Many people find it hard to believe that things that happened so long ago have any impact on us today. But they do. They really do. Let's take a look at one example involving Costa Mesa High School and the apple.
Years ago, apples played a major role in the development of our city. They were grown and sold along Newport Boulevard. People would come from all over just to buy Costa Mesa apples. So people thought the word apple should appear in the city's name.
Imagine, we could be out front of Apple Grove High or even Apple Valley High School. And you can forget about the Mustang, because today, this would be your mascot.
Wow, that means instead of seeing Mesa green, we could easily be seeing red. Well, another fascinating thing about history is that by taking us back to places where we've never been and showing us things we've never seen, it kind of changes the way we look at the things we see every day. Hey, it's just a matter of how you see things. Right, Dane?
That is so right. You know, sometimes if you're not looking, you might not see what's right there in front of you.
Take, for instance, the millions of broken seashells found here on the bluffs overlooking the Santa Ana River. Now, millions of broken seashells may not seem interesting to you. That is until you consider this. How'd they get from there to here?
Well, it all started about 3,000 years ago with the people who settled along what they called the Wenonah River. They were the Lookup Indians, a part of the Shoshone tribe, and there is evidence that more of them settled in Costa Mesa than anywhere else in Orange County.
Life was sure simple for the Lookup Indians living on the mesa. They lived in huts made from bent sticks covered with grass that they called wickiups.
When their wickiups became too cluttered, or when bugs moved in, they would simply burn them down and just build new ones. Even though the land on the mesa was fertile, these guys were definitely not farmers.
They were hunters and food gatherers, hunting small game for their meat source and gathering acorn nuts and seeds from the highlands.
The acorn nuts were dried and then crushed with stones and bowls to make their mush and cakes. These stones and bowls were discovered by farmers plowing their fields on the mesa in the early 1900s.
But it was the river and the tide pools that would supply them with their favorite feasts.
By hand and with nets, they would catch millions and millions of shelled creatures from the tide pools and the Wenonah River. They would then haul their catch back up here to the mesa, where the rest of the 400 to 500 villagers would eat the rich, soft flesh and discard the shells here on the ground.
3,000 years later, you can still see the remains from the Lookup Indians' most popular food here on the bluffs overlooking the Santa Ana River.
It says here that for thousands of years, the Indians lived this simple life along the Wenonah River, but that was about to change forever. You see, in Europe, countries were trying to become bigger and more powerful. So, quest for more land led them to the New World.
It was in 1542 that the land that we know as California was claimed in the name of the Spanish king.
But 200 years goes by. Spain does not pay much attention to the distant part of its empire. Even though they controlled the area, they did not know much about it.
So the king sends Gaspar de Portola and his soldiers to explore the area.
Missionaries also came, setting up the missions. that would colonize the land and educate the Indians to their ways of life and to Christianity.
Then ranchers came to raise and herd the livestock, starting the hide and tallow trade. They also supplied much of the food for the hungry explorers. And get this, as they moved north, the explorers discovered a river.
The explorers camped next to this river on St. Anne's Day, and in her honor named it the Santa Ana River. But Brad, wasn't it hard to control the land when they didn't live there?
Arlen, it sure was. So in 1810, the King of Spain, in order to hold on to and control the land, offered land grants to those who would settle in the so-called New World.
The land along the Santa Ana River was granted to one of the exploring soldiers, Jose Antonio Yorba, and his nephew. They named it the Rancho Santiago de Santa Ana.
The southwestern section of this rancho was mainly used for cattle grazing and later became our city of Costa Mesa.
During this time, 3 adobes were built along the river. It is believed that the purpose of these adobes was to give shelter to the soldiers, the missionaries, and the Spanish cowboys called vaqueros that passed through the area.
The Paulino, located where Fairview Park is today, was destroyed in the early 1900s by treasure hunters. Rumor was that a shepherd sold his flock for $1,000, then buried the money on the bluffs near the river. When he died, in came the treasure hunters.
The rice, which was located in the north section of town, was sadly torn down by the owners in 1919 to keep the treasure hunters off their land.
So that leaves only the estancia that still stands today. It's just north of Adams, and it has the distinction of being the oldest building in Costa Mesa, believed to have been built around the 1820s.
One of Costa Mesa's most prominent families, the Segerstroms, donated the building and the land to the city, who in 1966 renovated it back to its glory. The exterior of this California historical landmark is a reminder of the influence the Spanish played in the development of this area. While on the inside, it is a wonderful museum that preserves this area's Indian, Mission, Spanish, and Victorian past. Soon after the adobes were built, Mexico won its independence from Spain and took over control of the land. Then in 1848, the United States defeats Mexico over boundary disputes and takes over the land north of the Rio Grande River, including all of California. And that's when many people began heading out west.
It was the lure of the wild, wild west and the overcrowding of the cities in the east that brought many people to this area.
Yeah, but nothing would compare to what was about to happen in 1849.
Gold rush fever hits, and people come from all over to California. More food is needed, and the cattle industry becomes very profitable on the Mesa.
But it's real estate that creates the real frenzy in Southern California. Land is purchased, deeded to other family members, and used to pay off debts, breaking up the once larger land holdings.
The Rancho Santiago de Santa Ana is divided amongst several different owners. All in all, hundreds of land transactions had taken place up to this time.
With most of the large sections of land being used for agriculture and grazing, this allowed for the more numerous smaller portions to grow at a rapid pace. And it sure didn't hurt when the railroad companies started a rate war in 1877.
Cost for the trip from Missouri to Southern California on the old iron horses had dropped from $25 to only $1. So with land as the lure and tickets at a really good price, they hit the rails in search for that better life in the wild, wild west.
In search for that better life, some people came here to Costa Mesa. Okay, so it wasn't really called Costa Mesa back then. In fact, Costa Mesa, as we know it today, is actually a combination of 3 separate towns or villages. One of those 3 towns began back in 1887.
It was an exciting boom town called Fairview, and it started right here at the intersections of Harper and Adams. Now, you've probably seen that name Fairview around town before.
It was chosen because you could look one way and see the Pacific Ocean, then turn around and there's the mountains.
It was a spectacular or fair view in any direction. So developers purchased 1,762 acres, drew up plans, and divided the land into lots.
Local newspapers and handbills boasted daily of graded roads with the finest 100-foot wide main street around. with a future railroad connecting Fairview to Santa Ana. Both were also planned to go all the way through to the beach at Newport.
Well, it didn't take long for the word to get out, and soon the roads between Santa Ana and the new town of Fairview were bustling with activities.
Armed with land deeds, company officials, real estate agents, and prospective buyers were found in large numbers. Lots were sold and buildings were erected here along Harbor Boulevard.
Ah, but remember, it wasn't called Harbor Boulevard back then. So what was it called? Well, believe it or not, it was called Fairview Avenue. Now don't get that confused with today's Fairview Road because they're two totally different streets.
The town of Fairview, being the first developed area, boasts many of the first events within today's city boundaries. And the guys are going to tell you all about them.
Fairview Avenue was the first street. The first commercial building was the Fairview Development Company here on the corner of Baker and present-day Harbor Boulevard. By the end of the year, another first. In a small building next to the development company, the first private schoolhouse was opened.
The Henderson brothers in 1888 opened the first general store. It stood right there on the corner of Harper and Adams, where they sold food, clothing, and other necessities.
Soon, the townspeople could be seen traveling between the new doctor's office and the new drugstore, where inside the first post office began.
But the largest and most decorative building in town was the Fairview Hotel. 2 blocks north of the general store, it stood 3 stories tall and became known for its fantastic accommodations. The hotel served notice that Fairview was becoming a major town in the area.
Also contributing to the growth was the discovery of several mineral hot springs. Now the hot springs can be found here in what has become the northwest corner of Orange Coast College.
In order to capitalize on the free-flowing hot springs, Fairview built its very own bathhouse. It was located here in the area behind me at the corner of Harbor and Merrimack.
With a bathhouse and a hotel, it was believed that the town would become one of the most famous resort areas on the West Coast.
Another sure sign that Fairview was becoming a major town was the establishment of a newspaper. The Fairview Register rolled its first copy off the presses in 1888.
Railroads were also a sign in those days that an area was prospering. And on June 30th, 1888, the first passengers on the new Santa Ana, Fairview, and Pacific Railroad made their way from Santa Ana here to Fairview.
The steam engine would weave its way from Santa Ana in the north to about here on Harbor Boulevard, just south of MacArthur. Now remember, this used to be Fairview Avenue. The engine would then head straight into town.
By the end of summer, the people of Fairview would have a meat market, boarding house, and a church. In fact, things were going so well, they added something to showcase the spirit of the town.
Right here at the end of Fairview Avenue, a baseball field was built. The Fairview Knights baseball team, consisting of the town's business and community leaders, slid their way into the hearts of their fans. It became such a success that the railroad company had to schedule extra trips to and from Santa Ana to accommodate all the fans.
A few months later, discussions began on the need for a public school. In February of 1889, the County Board of Supervisors set up the Fairview School District.
This opened up the way for the first public school. In April, 19 students and 1 teacher began lessons using the private schoolhouse until completion of the new public school building.
The first public school was built here, just off of Adams Avenue, across from where Orange Coast College is today.
So, Dane, it seems that our city pioneers kind of began a tradition of education a long time ago.
That's right. Starting with that first school in Fairview over 100 years ago, Costa Mesa has become one of the leading centers for education.
Then what I don't understand is if Fairview was so successful, why aren't we called the city of Fairview?
Because, Arlen, just as quickly as the town began to boom, signs of trouble began to show. The land boom in California was falling off rapidly.
Bankruptcies and subdivisions that didn't take off were a common sight in Southern California. And in Fairview itself, sections of the railroad were washed away in the massive rainstorms of 1889.
The railroad company didn't think it would pay to replace the damaged sections of track, so they just removed the undamaged sections.
This began a small exodus of some of the townspeople. Businesses began closing, including the meat market, newspaper, drugstore, and the bathhouse. The general store, including the post office, was sold to new owners. Even the town doctor took down his shingle and headed for Huntington Beach. So almost as quickly as it started, the once booming town began to die.
Even with the collapse of the business section, people stayed and tried to save the town. In September of 1891, they opened the new public school building that was planned 3 years earlier. 29 students and 1 teacher began the school year in the large one-room, high-ceiling building known as Fairview School.
The owners of the Fairview Hotel moved it across from the abandoned bathhouse. Their hopes were to renew interest in the spa. They even had their own tennis court, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough to save the town.
In the early 1900s, a severe drought forced out more of the people. The general store burnt down, and the church moved its building to Huntington Beach. And once again, hopes of the town centered around the hotel. Using the mineral springs as the focus, the name was changed to Fairview Hot Springs.
Mud and mineral baths were offered. Cottages and dressing rooms were built around the new 100-foot by 60-foot swimming pool. And for more promotions, boxer Battling Nelson was invited to train at the resort for his upcoming fights.
Wannabe fighters were invited to step into the ring with the lightweight boxer. But again, it was not enough to revive the town. In 1915, the school that once drew students from all over the Mesa had to close its doors. And then the final blow. All hopes of reviving the town around the hotel were destroyed in 1918 when an earthquake cut off the flow of the mineral springs.
Now Fairview's fate, like the mineral springs, had been sealed.
In respect to the personalities and the high hopes of those who gave so much to the town, men like Irvin Bristol and H.H. Wakeham, as well as the name Fairview itself, can be seen memorialized several times throughout the city.
Our next village that would eventually become a major part of Costa Mesa was called Paulino. It was named in honor of Eduardo Paulino, who owned the land after the Rancho Santiago was split up.
It was in this section of town that in 1886, a group of Boston farmers settled in and began a tradition of agriculture. The settlement started as a few scattered farms.
Now you can still see some of the fields off the San Diego Freeway. And even though Paulino has become part of the financial and corporate section of our city, keep in mind all of this came after it became a part of the city of Costa Mesa.
So since the little village of Paulino never developed a business section, they would have to travel to Fairview or Santa Ana to do their shopping and other business transactions. However, in order to get their crops to the markets, they built a siding and loading dock along a new railroad that was built during the collapse of Fairview.
This new railroad ran from Santa Ana through Paulino all the way to the Newport Wharf. Then in 1912, the first Paulino Public School was built. It was a little one-room wooden schoolhouse. Now students would no longer have to travel the distance to attend school in Fairview.
For 2 years, the little wooden schoolhouse sat here on this corner at Bristol and Baker.
Then James Irvine offered to lease them land for just $25 a month. So the little wooden schoolhouse literally moved from here over to Newport and Paulino.
During the next 8 years, Paulino would see its population grow at a slow but steady pace, and in 1922, a new, bigger public school was built.
6 seniors graduated that year, and for 44 years, it served as another testament to the ongoing dedication to education in Costa Mesa.
Ironically, the progress that called for the building of the 2 schoolhouses would eventually come beckoning once again.
And in 1966, it called in a big way, as the second schoolhouse was torn down to make room for the Newport Freeway, now known as the Costa Mesa Freeway. And the loading dock that had played such a major role in the prosperity of the town of Paulino would also fall victim to this sign of progress.
Wow, it's really interesting when you think about railroads and their influence on our towns and villages. Fairview was almost wiped out completely when its railroad was washed away. And Paulino, well, for years it grew steadily by transporting its crops to the market via the Santa Ana to Newport Railroad. But nowhere was the old Iron Horse's impact felt more than our third village.
You see, railroads were often built next to or even right through the middle of the most prosperous of towns. The old locomotive wasn't just a sign of the prosperity of a town.
Sometimes it gave birth to it. Now, nowhere would the birth of a new town be more influenced by the railroad than right here in our third village.
Remember, during the demise of Fairview in 1890, a new railroad was built. The Santa Ana and Newport Railroad ran along Newport Boulevard. It cut its way through miles of vast, fertile land, and it didn't take long for farmers to discover this agricultural gold mine.
Soon, 3 large farms that stretched all the way from the Santa Ana River to the Back Bay surrounded the new railroad. Even though you'd find hogs, cattle, and horses, their main business was growing crops, and they would grow bountifully on this tableland overlooking the Pacific Ocean.
To move their grains and crops to the markets, the farmers built not one, but 2 sidings along the railroad between 22nd and 23rd Streets. Known as the Thurin Station, it worked out great for 2 of the farms. But for Gregory Harper and his brother, who manned the farm located farther south, it was a bit of a hassle to get to the Thurin Station.
To accommodate the Harper brothers who manned the southern area farm, a loading and siding dock was built for them here, where 18th and Newport Boulevard are today.
The area would even become known as Harper in honor of the Harper brothers. The early 1900s was a pretty simple life on the Mesa. There stood 3 farmhouses amongst the fields. Rodents, jackrabbits, squirrels, and coyotes ran wild, and hawks, condors, and herons patrolled the skies. But that simple farming life was about to change forever.
When people came to Southern California looking for real estate, it didn't take long for them to realize that the Mesa was truly a gold mine. Imagine what this magnificent panoramic view of the Northwest to the southeast looked like back in the early 1900s.
It was so spectacular that in 1906, a development company called Townsend Damon purchased 1,700 acres of the San Joaquin Ranch from James Irvine. Now keep that name Townsend in mind, because he's very important in the development of the Harper area.
The purchase was for almost the entire eastern section of Harper. They called it Newport Heights. It was divided into 5-acre lots for sale at a cost of $1,500.
To make the purchases even more attractive, the developers installed one of the first water distribution systems in the area. Streets were laid out, and before they knew it, 200 lots were sold and buildings began to appear.
And the discovery of oil didn't hurt either, as those who came to work in the oil fields would need places to live. So more lots are sold, and a new track is planned called Newport Mesa.
By 1908, the village was growing so rapidly that just off of Newport, here on 17th, with the help of Mr. Townsend, the people of Harper renovated an old farmhouse and used it for their first school. Mr. Townsend also hired the first school teacher. So now Harper's kids didn't have to make the long journey to Fairview or Newport to attend school.
Wow, I guess those stories of our parents and grandparents walking miles just to get an education really were true.
That's right. Some of those stories they told us really were true. Well, now that the kids got a break, it was time for the parents. When the store at Fairview closed, shopping for the basic necessities had to be done in Santa Ana. That is until Harper's first commercial building, the Osment General Store, opened here on 18th and Newport. It was a large 2-story building.
The upstairs part of the building was where the Osment family lived.
Downstairs was the 1-room store that had 2 counters on each side.
On one side, you could buy your groceries, and on the other, you could buy your yard goods.
Families living in the area were now able to get most of their necessities without traveling far from home. But there was still one important item that they couldn't get in their village. You still had to travel miles to get your mail.
Since that was the major source of communication with people back then, Harper residents decided they needed their very own post office.
But in order to become an authorized post office of the U.S. postal system, you need a name. Even though the Harper brothers were no longer living in the area, the townspeople decided to keep Harper as their official name.
So on March 25, 1909, Postmaster General of the U.S. appointed Walter Osment as the first postmaster of Harper. The logical choice for the first site of the new post office was Walter's General Store.
Now that there was no reason for the townspeople to leave, Mr. Osment introduces the first automobile. and others quickly followed. Soon the automobile would also have a major impact on the growth of the town. But I can only imagine how peculiar that first unknown object must have looked to the residents.
Well, I'll bet some of them were a little frightened at the sight of that horseless carriage coming down their road for the first time. But I bet they got over that pretty quickly.
So how do you know that, Dane?
Because the people of Harper were kind of innovators themselves. Consider this. They lived in a county known for its oranges, but did they grow oranges like everyone else? No. They grew apples. And here along Newport Boulevard, apple trees became the main items grown and sold, and it was apples, apples, and more apples.
This whole area would become laden with apples, and a new industry was beginning on the Mesa. Just as the apple industry grew, so did the population. It grew so much that in 1910 at 17th and Orange Street, a new two-room school was opened to handle all the additional kids coming to the area.
The community was becoming so attractive that in 1913, a third tract called Fairview Farms opened. And just like the successful Newport Heights tract, the developers installed its very own complete water distribution system. It was very impressive.
Water was pumped from 3 artesian wells near the Santa Ana River up and over the edge of the mesa to this huge standpipe. It was then carried by water wagons onto a very large reservoir that was constructed near 19th and Placentia.
Now all of these businesses you see behind me are sitting on what used to be the reservoir. It had a 1.25 million gallon capacity. And that's a lot of water.
So in order to keep the system in proper working order,
the developers formed the first water district, called the Fairview Farms Mutual Water Company. This allowed the system to be owned and operated by the local landowners. It was such a success, the Newport Mesa tract decided to form the Newport Mesa Irrigation District. And 42 years later, the two districts would join together with 2 others and form what has become the Mesa Consolidated Water District that supplies most of the water to our city today.
In the years following the opening of the new tract, the population continued to grow. The automobile became more popular.
And between 1915 and 1925, Newport Boulevard became the place for a Sunday drive. It was the quickest way for people in North Orange County to get to and from the beach. To accommodate the beach travelers, businesses like this gas station would appear. But the clear favorites would be the fruit and vegetable stands.
Now, more than ever, people began to discover that Harper had some of the best homegrown fruits and vegetables anywhere. And their biggest prize, of course, was apples.
Harper had become famous for its apples. People started coming from miles around just to purchase the homegrown fruit. Apples and apple cider were everywhere. But other things were happening between 1915 and 1925.
it was around this time that one of the most influential families in Costa Mesa's retail and business industries was gaining prominence.
Around 1915, the Segerstrom family built a farmhouse and barn about 3 miles north of Harper. They would become one of the top producers and shippers of lima beans in the United States. And the Segerstrom family was instrumental in turning this and the Harper area into a major agricultural site. One of the old farmhouses of the family that to this day continues to be principal players in the development of Costa Mesa can still be seen just north of the San Diego Freeway off Fairview Road.
But it wasn't just about lima beans in Harper. Everything grew. Even the number of orchards, farms, and houses grew. Some of them were spread out on the outer edges of the village.
For some, it was a bit of a hike getting to school every day. So in order to get the kids from the outer lying areas and from Fairview, whose school had closed, to the school in Harper, W.W. Middleton began the first bus system. 8 happy kids that used to walk miles to school rode Harper's first school bus in 1915.
And leaving the schoolhouse after holding services there for 3 years and coming here was the Harper Methodist Episcopal Church. Their new home and Harper's first church building was ready.
The congregation in 1928 would make one final move to their new home on 19th Street. Today, it's one of the oldest and most recognizable buildings in the city.
Even the U.S. entering into World War I didn't stop the progress of the village. Many of the young soldiers from other small towns
would relocate to the big cities, but Harper would see most of its fighting men return to their town.
where the main attraction of this area was still its agriculture. And in 1919, George Hall of Fairview Farms wins Best Individual Display of Fruits and Vegetables, and Donald J. Dodge, future Justice of the Peace, wins for Best Apple Exhibit at the Huntington Beach Fair. And wow, what a boost that would be for the local farmers and merchants.
Harper and the surrounding area had grown from 3 farmhouses in 1900 to around 300 people by 1920.
And Charles T. Winkle, one of the most prominent figures in the development of our city, came to town, purchased the general store, and became the postmaster.
The little farming village, showing enormous signs of progress, decided to find a new name.
They wanted one that better suit them, and they were tired of their mail ending up in the little town of Harperville. So in 1920, a contest was held, offering $25 to the person who could come up with the best name.
Names pertaining to apples, like Apple Grove and Apple Valley, were submitted. But finally, the name Costa Mesa, which means coastal tableland, submitted by Miss Alice Plummer, was selected. If you're ever downtown, check this out. She even has a street named in her honor.
Boom! Well, that's what happens to the new town now known as Costa Mesa. The second store on Newport opens, called the Wayside Market. It featured what else but apples and apple cider. Ice cream and soft drinks also became popular items to those traveling to the beach, as well as the local residents. Other stores began popping up on Newport Boulevard. So much building was taking place that a lumberyard was established, and T. Winkle opened his first hardware store. As the postmaster, he also made it the home of the new post office.
Now it's gone today, but in 1923, a larger school was built here behind me at the corner of 19th and Newport. It was the first school bearing the new name Costa Mesa. There were 187 students and 5 teachers that year at the Costa Mesa Grammar School.
The Santa Ana Register reported during the year about 250 buildings had been constructed. Many of those were homes for families. The paper went on to say that Costa Mesa was a rapidly growing modern city. Although technically not a city yet, but it was a great place to be.
We made our fun. We played a lot of Annie over and we had apple boxes. We made houses out of them and crawled around in the houses. And we played marbles, hopscotch, and we played ball. And everybody had their garden. Most people had their chickens. Of course, you got up closer to town. You had the Alphabeta. T. Winkle had the hardware store. Dr. Houston was the dentist. Everybody that lived here liked it the way it was, and it was a very good place to raise a family.
Wow, between 1920 and 1924, Costa Mesa had grown from 300 people to 2,400. It looks like the town was making really big strides.
Big strides indeed. And another was the addition of the first public library. It started out with 200 books donated by the county. Thanks to the donations of Carl and Fanny Bixby Spencer, the shelves were soon stocked with thousands of books. Then 2 other very important departments in the town began.
Before 1925, if there was a fire in the city of Costa Mesa, it was very chaotic. They had to rely upon the generosity and, unfortunately, the inexperience of the neighbors to extinguish the flames. So they acquired their first fire truck, and Fred Bush became the first volunteer fire chief. His men were also all volunteers. And even though they were community leaders and held jobs and titles in Costa Mesa, they trained very hard to become efficient firefighters. So when they were called to duty, they were well prepared to protect their town.
Crime really wasn't a problem back then, but because of the usual squabbles and things, the town realized that if it wanted to keep the peace, it needed to get law enforcement. So they hired Frank Big Boy Vaughn as the first police officer. Since there were no traffic lights in town, his main task was to chase down those in a hurry to get to the beach. His Ford Coupe, which he used as the first police car, was said to be the fastest car around, and everyone knew you couldn't outrun old Big Boy.
We were becoming such a big hit that in 1928, the city of Santa Ana invited Costa Mesa to become part of their city. But thankfully, our founders passed on that idea. I think our forefathers had bigger plans in mind back then.
The rapid growth of the village was slowed during the Great Depression of 1929, and there were some extremely tough times.
But the town was not destroyed like so many others during the Depression.
That's right. And one of the good things at that time was a joint venture between the city of Newport Beach and the town of Costa Mesa.
It's the opening of Newport Harbor Union High School. On September 23, 1930, 196 students from both towns attended the first classes at their new high school.
Well, we've all heard the name Goat Hill. It is believed to have started as a rivalry between the kids of Newport and Costa Mesa.
Now, we don't know who started the rivalry first, but the story goes that the families on the Mesa attempted to raise cows and failed, so they then turned to raising goats.
So the kids from Newport would tease the kids from Mesa by saying they were from Goat Hill.
The kids from Mesa would tease the kids from Newport, calling them mackerel heads. Well, the rivalry doesn't continue anymore today, but the name Goat Hill definitely does.
Then another disaster hits, and I mean hits hard. In the late afternoon on March 10th, 1933, a powerful earthquake tries to destroy what the Depression couldn't.
Damage was extensive, as Costa Mesa is one of the hardest hit areas. Walls caved in, chimneys fell, and glass broke. The grammar school was virtually destroyed. Newport Boulevard looked like a war zone. It was a miracle that no one in Costa Mesa was killed.
Then, the railroad running down Newport Boulevard that had given birth to the town was abandoned.
Was it time to panic? No way. Because in spite of all these tragedies, there were still a lot of good things going on in Costa Mesa.
Alvin Pinkley purchased the drugstore on Newport Boulevard. The store and the Pinkleys would remain popular fixtures in Costa Mesa for years.
It started at the soda fountain. They got 5-cent Coca-Colas, 5-cent ice cream cones. Kids came in. If they had a penny, we had 100 different kinds of penny candy. They'd buy a penny candy, and we furnished them with funny books, and they sat all over the floor reading funny books. And we kept it a small town atmosphere that worked very well.
Comic books weren't the only thing they were reading. As the first issue of the Costa Mesa Globe was published, it would change hands several times and end up as our own daily pilot.
Then in 1934, Harbor Boulevard was officially dedicated. No longer known as Fairview Avenue, it gave Costa Mesa a more direct route to the northern section of Orange County and vice versa.
Costa Mesa seemed to be doing its best to survive the tragedies of the 1930s. The damaged Costa Mesa Grammar School was rebuilt and renamed Main School.
They also finished the new Rochester Street Fire Station. But they would have to make it through one more test, as severe rainstorms hit in 1938. 22 people lost their lives, and thousands of dollars worth of crops were destroyed in Orange County. The Santa Ana River overflowed her banks, and the lowlands flooded. But once again, as with earlier storms, Costa Mesa was spared much of the destruction because they sit high on the tabletop, and most of the water just drained the lowlands. Surviving all this, the people of Costa Mesa decided to hold a celebration in the summer of 1938.
It was held here on Newport between 18th and 19th Streets. And 5,000 people came to the first Scarecrow Carnival run by the Chamber of Commerce. They had a parade, street dance, and scarecrow contest. The next year, over 20,000 people came, and it became a featured story in Look magazine. The main attraction was the famous talking scarecrow. Then in the third year, the lady scarecrow was stolen. It ended up the next morning on the streets of Tijuana, and it made the national news. Unfortunately, this popular event was canceled because of World War II.
At the end of the 30s, the little Alpha Beta Market would move into a larger, more modern building. It became the town's first supermarket. Their new location was here, where the Costa Mesa courtyards are today. And early in the 40s, T-Winkle moved from this hardware store into a larger one. The new store became one of the busiest places in town.
It was located here at 18th and Newport, just about where the old general store used to be. And not only could you find the usual hardware items,
but since the Edison company, the phone company, the gas company had no offices in town, you could also pay those utility bills at T-Winkle's hardware store.
The hardware store would even cash the checks of the senior citizens, and it became a local hangout. These actions were a sign of an exploding population and good times. while the rest of the world was exploding in a very different way.
As war broke out in Europe, we broke ground on the United States Air Corps Replacement Training Center, later changed to the Santa Ana Army Air Base. Keep in mind, the base wasn't actually in Costa Mesa at the time, but it would have a huge effect on the town. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, construction intensified, and in February of 1942, the first cadets from all over the country arrived.
The base was a big city, actually. When you stop and think, we had a big hospital there and several school buildings, quite a few school buildings, and you had warehouses, a chapel, theater, and post office. Yeah, that was the most important thing they had here, as far as we were concerned, is getting our letters from home, you know. And the packages, Mom was cooking her cookies and cakes and things like that. Right? That was an important part of the whole thing. But the main purpose of the base was to classify you for pilot, bombardier, or navigator training. Of course, when you were through, they expected you to act like an officer and a gentleman.
Costa Mesa had become a major part of the military machine in the effort to win World War II. At its peak, the base had a population of 23,000, which amazingly was 5 times as many people living in the whole town of Costa Mesa at that time.
Over 200,000 men and women would pass through the air base, boosting the local economy and the population. And they liked the area so much, many would return to start businesses or make their homes here.
After the war, the base was closed, but many of the buildings were purchased and moved to be used all over Southern California.
And one of the old barracks was moved to become the first St. Joaquim's Roman Catholic Church. It now serves as the Costa Mesa Grange, and here it is today.
But what is a grange? A grange is a hall used by farmers for social gatherings, but it also reminds us of all those who came through the air base.
The buildings were so inexpensive to get, the church decided to go after the base chapel too. It was moved to Orange Street, where on Christmas Day the first Mass was held. They've come a long way since then.
The land and many of the air base's remaining buildings were offered for sale to any educational institution for just $1.
So 202 acres of land and several of the buildings were purchased to become Orange Coast College. Many of the buildings were renovated just in time for the arrival of the 500 students who began studies in September of 1948. Today, over 24,000 students attend classes, making it one of the largest and most accredited community colleges in the country.
Another 126 acres of the base was purchased for a private 4-year institution by the Southern California Assemblies of God. And in 1950, 300 students embarked in their pursuit of higher education at Southern California Bible College. One of the air base's buildings is still in use as the gymnasium at what is now known as Southern California College, where around 1,300 students register for classes each semester.
And all of these places are on land once a part of the Santa Ana Army Air Base. Now you know why the base is still important to Costa Mesa today.
Back in 1946, spirits were high after the war, and to raise money for community events, the Lions Club started their annual fish fry. They started their 3-day celebration and carnival with the parade on what used to be Newport Avenue. It raised thousands of dollars and attracted thousands of visitors from all over Orange County each summer. Today, it is held at Lions Park, where this popular event generates over $150,000, attracts over 50,000 people, and serves about 2 tons of fish. Well, fish frying wasn't the only thing new in 1946. I'll bet you didn't know that Costa Mesa once had its very own airport. In fact, the building you see behind me was originally the airport's front office. 3 returning World War II Air Corps pilots came back and started the Balboa Airport. The airstrip ran parallel to 19th Street, but didn't last too long.
But there was success over on Newport Boulevard with the opening of the first movie theater. The Mesa Theater in 1948 became a popular place to the nearly 12,000 people who called Costa Mesa home. 1 year later, another means of entertainment also opened. It was the first drive-in theater.
The community park was also completed. Back then, its official name was Costa Mesa Park, but soon, many would simply refer to it as Airplane Park. I wonder why. Now known as Lions Park, in honor of the Lions Club that made it popular through their fish fry, it was located at the corner of Center and Anaheim Streets. With the park and the Boys Club, this part of town really became a place for families.
The 50s would be a defining moment for Costa Mesa, starting with plans for a state mental hospital. It would take 9 years for its completion, but jobs were created and more families moved in because of the facility. It was a definite signal Costa Mesa was becoming one of the most recognizable areas around.
Realizing this, U.S. Senate candidate and eventually the 37th President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon, gave a primary campaign speech in Costa Mesa. Since then, some pretty important people have stopped in Costa Mesa in their bid for the White House,
where they may have visited our first shopping center at 17th and Orange. Dubbed the Miracle Mile, later known as the Mesa Center, it was a great addition to the town.
In fact, Costa Mesa was becoming the place to be. Remember the airport we told you about at 19th and Placentia? Well, in 1953, all 200 acres were being turned into the largest single-family home development in Orange County at the time.
Called the Newport Vista, or better known as the Freedom Homes Tract, as you can see, they were very affordable. And many people took this opportunity, and the population more than tripled from 4,600 in 1940 to over 16,000 in 1953.
This huge growth in both commercial and the population, along with the desire to be politically responsible for themselves, led to the most important event in the history of Costa Mesa.
Newport Heights, Newport Mesa, and Fairview Farms, the three areas that made up the town of Costa Mesa, decided to hold a vote to incorporate and officially become a city.
The opposition pleaded incorporation would raise taxes substantially for the new police, fire, city hall personnel, and other expenses that are required to run a city.
With the Chamber of Commerce behind them, those for it argued the city would benefit greatly from being able to control their own destiny. There was also fear if they remained under county jurisdiction, the oil industry might move in.
So on June 29, 1953, by a margin of less than 400 votes, Costa Mesa, with its 3.5 square miles and 16,185 people, officially became a city.
It really was the defining moment for the new city, and it meant that from now on, the residents of Costa Mesa would control their own destiny. Now there was a great deal of work to be done. They selected the top community leaders to serve as a 5-member city council. Charles T. Winkle, one of the most influential businessmen of that time, became the city's very first mayor. And this was our first city hall. It may not look like much, but for the next 4 years, the city staffers would handle the very important day-to-day operations out of this small office. Although the building was small, the council members back then had big plans for the city. Getting down to business, they hired the first city manager. A planning commission was organized, a police chief, and 3 officers were hired, and the city seal was designed. A year later, the first paid fire department, consisting of 1 chief and 6 firemen, were also hired, replacing the old volunteer department that had protected the city for the past 28 years. And even though there were still no traffic lights in the city, Costa Mesa was now fully manned to head into the second half of the 20th century.
Okay, let's just slow down for a minute. In 1920, there were about 300 people in the town of Costa Mesa.
And in 1953, at the time of incorporation, there was just over 16,000 people. That's a phenomenal increase.
But the city boundaries had not changed that much at all. If the population was to continue to grow, then Costa Mesa would need to find a way to expand its boundaries.
Well, they must have found a way, because by 1970, the population soared to over 72,000 people.
Many new housing tracts, additional businesses, a more active Chamber of Commerce, and 2 new freeways,
along with the increase in parks, restaurants, theaters, and cultural activities, interacted to create the explosion.
Wait a minute. What I want to know, how they do it. How did Costa Mesa increase its population and its boundaries so much after it became a city?
Okay, keep this in mind. In 1953, Costa Mesa officially becomes a city. It has more people, more houses, and more businesses than it used to. But it is still just centered right around here which is the old Harper area.
So in 1955, as land in the old Harper area became scarce, the city of Costa Mesa began adding the unincorporated and less developed areas in the north. Now this is called annexation.
Section by section, one after the other, they would all eventually become a part of the city of Costa Mesa.
After 7 years of annexation, Fairview, Paulino, and Harper, along with some of their surrounding areas, were joined together and formed our present city boundaries.
So that's how they did it. They grew through annexation.
That's correct, Arlen. But there were also many other things happening during this time. In 1957, the second City Hall was completed right here. Now, the original building is gone, but most of you will recognize the architectural award-winning Senior Center that has taken its place.
By 1959, Harbor Boulevard was still rather undeveloped. To service the growing northwest section of town, the Harbor Shopping Center was completed. A food giant, J.C. Penney's, and around 30 smaller stores made it a city favorite. And Thrifty's, now known as Rite Aid, still remains today. But by 1960,
it would be recreational and entertainment venues that would become popular with the opening of the clubhouse at the Mesa Verde Country Club, where they have hosted many elite events such as the Senior PGA Toshiba Open and the Kona Lanes Bowling Center. Notice how barren the corner of Harbor and Adams was in 1960. And right here is the bowling center that many still enjoy today.
Soon, businesses began popping up on Harbor, and it would quickly become a major thoroughfare.
One of those that began in 1962 was Harbor Boulevard's first major department store, and it's still a fixture today. Can you guess which one we're talking about?
In 1963 and 1964, the intersection at Harbor and Adams would come to life again. It started on Christmas Day with the opening of the second walk-in movie theater.
It was the Edwards Cinema Theater, and down the street, the new post office in the booming Mesa Verde area had become the main office.
And First Lieutenant John Connell returns to Costa Mesa to open the first car dealership on Harbor Boulevard. Later joined by Theodore Robbins Ford, together they started
what would become one of the largest boulevard of cars in the area. Add banks, restaurants, and the first commercial high-rise.
And as it was in 1888 when it was the center of the town of Fairview, this intersection here at Harbor and Adams was booming.
In 1965, the Mesa Verde Branch Library was dedicated, giving the city 2 libraries.
That same year, Estancia High School was completed. It joined Costa Mesa High School that was built in 1958. As a power in education, Costa Mesa in 1966 began to emerge as a power in the financial arena as well, as a strange growth sprouts from the Sagerstrom's lima bean fields. It was the May Company, the first store to open at the new South Coast Plaza Mall, soon to become one of the most profitable shopping centers in the U.S. Giving Southern Californians the full advantage of the shopping center was the beginning of 2 new freeways, as sections of the San Diego and Newport freeways were completed. They clipped the city's northern and eastern boundaries. The Newport was later changed to the Costa Mesa Freeway because it never really made it to Newport Beach. Across the street from the shopping center, the emerging South Coast Town Center, with its banks and savings and loan offices, along with the freeways and the plaza, would quickly turn this area into a major financial center. If all this didn't shatter the stigma of Goat Hill, maybe the tallest high-rise in Orange County would. The 18-story Bethel Towers was an awesome sight then, and it still stands out as a giant in the downtown area.
In 1967, City Hall and all the departments moved into their brand new, modern 5-story building. Built on land that was once part of the old air base, there was great reason for the big celebration, as the Civic Center and the police facility were dedicated on the city's 14th anniversary.
During their anniversary year, the city opened the Costa Mesa Golf and Country Club. It gave the city 2 quality golf sites, where many Masons have celebrated important events in their lives.
The population just keeps growing. With the start of the 70s, it reaches over 72,000. Costa Mesa had become a progressive city and one of the few with its own helicopter. Actually, the residents would have to get used to the sight of 2 helicopters in the sky, with Eagle 1 and Eagle 2 taking to the air.
These extra officers were not only needed to protect and serve the citizens of Costa Mesa,
but in 1972, with the addition of the new tri-level Ice Capades Chalet,
the Edwards Cinema 4 Theater, Bullock's at South Coast Plaza, and the grand opening of Fedco, they were needed to make sure, with the growing number of visitors to our area, everyone was obeying the laws of our city.
By the end of 1973, construction began on the tallest hotel in Orange County at the time. After its completion, the South Coast Plaza Hotel, standing 17 stories and with a price tag of $18 million, was a definite sight off the San Diego freeway.
During the mid-70s, women all over were making big strides, and in Costa Mesa, Norma Herzog was the first woman elected to the city council and the first female police officer took to the streets.
But not going very far were automobiles, as the country became gripped by the gas shortage. Many people would find themselves waiting in long lines at the service stations.
But there was another shortage they would have to face.
With all the developing that had gone on, they needed to somehow find a way to not only protect part of the land, but also part of the past.
So in order to protect this 257 acres of land between Placentia Avenue and the Santa Ana River,
in 1973, the citizens of Costa Mesa voted to purchase 70 acres and preserve it as open land.
By a landslide, 71% of the voters approved the purchase of this and several other remaining open areas to be used for parks. Currently, the city has 26 parks, totaling 385 acres, of which over half are undeveloped and pretty much in their original state.
I think the citizens of Costa Mesa knew what they were doing back then.
You know what, Brad? I think you're right.
With land becoming scarce, the city would turn towards redevelopment of the downtown area.
So they started by buying the Boys Club. The plan? To acquire the entire block north of the park, build a new downtown fire station,
a full-service community center, and a new modern library, bringing many new people into the old Harper area. To handle the new traffic, 19th Street was widened.
At the end of the 70s, the city would find fresh new ways to grow. With all the prestige and affluence of the area, Costa Mesa would begin the largest cultural revolution to hit Orange County. The award-winning South Coast Repertory Theater was completed in the town center.
You could see nationally acclaimed productions, many of them premieres, on their two stages. In the years that followed, it was joined by the Performing Arts Center, a $70 million structure that has played host to the Kirov and Bolshoi ballets, along with performances by none other than Luciano Pavarotti.
Add to that the Civic Playhouse, the Theater District, the California Scenario Gardens, the Pacific Amphitheater, and several art galleries throughout the city, and you can see why Costa Mesa has gained the reputation as Orange County's City of the Arts.
The start of the 80s saw the return of some very meaningful works. Paintings by a Santa Ana Army Air Base sergeant called the Gremlin Murals. They hung in the Servicemen's Club and portrayed what life was like on the base. Featured were dozens of pesky little gremlins. It was believed gremlins would torment the men and their machines during their war missions. They can be seen causing havoc throughout the murals. When the club was sold, the murals were removed. They were later discovered in an Air Force museum and returned to the Costa Mesa Historical Society, who will permanently put them on display at their originating site on the campus of Orange Coast College for everyone to enjoy.
In 1985, the first stage of the city's major redevelopment project opened with the courtyards, and it definitely started the revitalization of the downtown area. But the grandest phase of the redevelopment project made its debut in 1992 as the long-awaited Triangle Square opens for business.
Heavy hitters like Nike Town and Virgin Megastore come to Costa Mesa and turn this place into the Melrose of Orange County.
And how fitting, as the final section of the Costa Mesa Freeway was finished, delivering its travelers right to the middle of what started out as a small farming and agricultural village.
You know, we have definitely turned into one of the most prominent communities in business, finance, education, and culture around. So you see, the city of Costa Mesa definitely has a rich history.
And today, we are all at the forefront of tomorrow's history. So if there's anything we've learned from the past, it's that in Costa Mesa, we are definitely not done yet.
Well, guys, you're right. There are major changes taking place in our city every day. And I know that I'm looking forward to all the wonderful things in store for Costa Mesa in the not too distant future.